There are books that were meant to be remembered, and books that were meant to be hidden. The Book of Enoch belongs to the second kind, a text whispered about more than it was read, condemned as dangerous, and yet never entirely forgotten. It drifts like a phantom across the centuries, glimpsed only in fragments, remembered in echoes, and carried in secrecy by distant peoples on the edge of the known world. Its survival feels accidental, or perhaps deliberate, as though some invisible hand wished it both concealed and preserved. Imagine for a moment an ancient scroll sealed in resin, buried beneath dust, and left within the vaults of time. This is what the Book of Enoch became, a sealed chest of forbidden knowledge. Early Christians quoted it freely, finding in its pages visions of angels, prophecies of judgment, and the mysterious figure later known as the Son of Man. The Epistle of Jude draws directly from it, calling upon Enoch's ancient prophecy against the ungodly. Tertullian, a church father of the 2nd century, defended it with passion, declaring that it was too sacred to abandon. Origen and Clement of Alexandria too knew its words, regarding it as part of the early Christian imagination. For them, Enoch's voice reached across the ages like the echo of a prophet who walked with God and was not. But elsewhere, suspicion grew. Rabbis declared it too strange, too apocalyptic, too full of fire and shadow. Bishops in Rome and Byzantium turned from it, until the book was formally cast into silence, declared heresy, banished from Scripture, scattered into fragments. And yet, it endured. While the Western world forgot it, far to the south, in the highlands of Ethiopia, the book was cherished. Translated into Ge'ez, it became part of the sacred canon of the Ethiopian Church. There, in stone-carved monasteries clinging to cliffs, under the painted domes of Lalibela, and along the high plateaus where priests walked with manuscripts wrapped in cloth, Enoch's visions survived. Imagine the chants of liturgy echoing across the valleys, the flicker of butter lamps illuminating pages, the smell of incense hanging in mountain air. In this sanctuary of isolation, the Book of Enoch was not a forbidden relic, but a living word, read and remembered, copied by hand, its legends woven into Ethiopia's spiritual tapestry. Elsewhere, only whispers remained. A fragment quoted here, a passing allusion there. Medieval scholars puzzled over faint references in old writings, but the book itself seemed gone, as though it had been swallowed by time. For centuries, Europe knew of it only as rumor, a missing scripture, half remembered, suspected to exist yet always just beyond reach. Then, in the 20th century, the desert itself gave up its secrets. Bedouin shepherds searching for lost goats stumbled into caves near Qumran, on the edge of the Dead Sea. Inside, sealed in clay jars, lay scrolls that had slumbered for 2,000 years. When scholars unrolled the brittle parchment, they found words written in Aramaic, the language spoken in the time of Jesus, and among them, fragments of the Book of Enoch. The discovery was like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading through the scholarly world. Proof that Enoch had not been a medieval fabrication, nor a local curiosity of Ethiopia, but an ancient text of the Second Temple period, once circulating widely among Jewish communities. Proof that it had shaped imaginations in ways long forgotten, that it was older than much of the Bible itself. Why then did it provoke such unease? Perhaps because of what it contained. Within its pages, angels walk among men, secrets of heaven are revealed, the future of nations is shown in allegory, and the very throne of God is unveiled in visions of fire and storm. It is not a tidy book, nor a safe one. It promises judgment for the corrupt, punishment for the mighty, and hope for the forgotten, It speaks of forbidden unions, giants who devoured the world, chains prepared for angels, and a flood sent not only for mankind, but to erase the offspring of heaven itself. It is a scripture that trembles with dread and radiance, too strange to ignore, too unsettling to embrace. And so it was hidden. Yet the question remains, was it hidden by chance or by design? Was Enoch's voice silenced because it strayed too far into myth, or because it revealed truths others feared? Some whisper it contained warnings too dire for the powerful, visions too unsettling for the faithful, revelations that blurred the line between heaven and earth. Others wonder if it was suppressed because of its messianic vision, a radiant Son of Man who judges kings and sits at the side of the Ancient of Days. Such a figure, so close to the later Christ, may have been seen as too dangerous, too divisive, too prophetic to allow. Whatever the reason, the book lay sealed in obscurity, its words like embers waiting for breath. Tonight, we will open that chest. We will step into the forbidden pages of Enoch, tracing the fall of angels, the rise of giants, the visions of heaven, and the secrets of a world remade by flood. The story is not just of a man who walked with God, but of a cosmos trembling under the weight of its own mysteries. Let us begin, then, in the hush of secrecy, with a book that should not exist, yet does. It began with an oath whispered among the stars, not shouted in rebellion, not declared in triumph, but spoken with the quiet intensity of those who knew they were crossing a boundary that could never be uncrossed. On the wind-swept ridges of Mount Hermon, the air was thin and sharp, carrying with it the scent of cedar and snow. Clouds moved across the moon like veils, and the silence was heavy, as though the mountain itself was listening. Upon that summit, 200 angels gathered. They were the watchers, appointed to observe the earth, to record its rhythms, to safeguard the unfolding of creation. But their vigil had grown restless. Looking upon the daughters of men, they felt a stirring of longing that would not be quieted. It was not duty that filled their hearts, but desire, a flame that burned brighter each night as they looked down upon mortal beauty and felt themselves drawn toward it. At their head stood Shemihazah, a prince of commanding presence. His voice carried like a low thunder across the rocks as he addressed the host. You know why we are gathered. You know what lies before us. If one should fall, let all fall together. If one should break heaven's command, let none retreat into cowardice. Swear with me, brothers, that we will bind ourselves in this. A murmur spread among them, hesitation, doubt, fear of the Most High, for they knew the weight of rebellion. Yet one by one voices answered, first uncertain, then stronger, until the mountain rang with their vow. Shemihazah sealed the words with a final cry, and the oath was carved, not by hand, but into the memory of creation itself. Mount Hermon became the witness, its name bound forever to the covenant of defiance. With the oath spoken, the descent began. They fell not as meteors blazing in fury, but as embers drifting from the hearth of heaven, soft and glowing. Cloaked in the forms of men, they walked the valleys, their radiance dimmed but not extinguished. Their beauty dazzled the eyes of mortals. Their voices were like songs that stirred the heart. The daughters of earth beheld them and were drawn, and the watchers took wives from among them. From these unions were born the nephilim, giants whose very existence bent the order of creation. They stood taller than the tallest walls, their stride covering valleys in moments, their strength greater than herds of oxen. Eyes like burning coals, voices like rolling storms, appetites vast as rivers. These were the children of heaven's desire and earth's flesh. What they gave seemed like gifts of brilliance, but each spark carried its shadow. The first spark was metal. In the nights after the oath on Hermon, furnaces woke like new stars on the ground. Azazel stood where river stones met wind, showing men how to breathe fire into ore, how to coax color from the buried heart of mountains. The bellows sighed. Charcoal gave up its heat. Veins of copper bled into channels. Iron sweated and glowed. Hammers fell in steady rhythm, a heartbeat that drew neighbors from their doors. From anvils came shapes the world had never known, plough blades that parted stubborn soil, knives that sang through fiber, nails that fastened timber against storm. Sparks flew, brief worlds of orange, and for a moment everything felt easy. Fields yielded more grain, timber-framed houses with surer angles, carts rolled with fewer groans. Then the shadow lengthened. The same heat that softened iron for harvest hardened it for conquest. Sword edges bit deeper than bone. Spearheads found the small place between ribs, and shields turned men into walls. The sound from the forges did not change, yet the meanings did. Where once the hammer called dawn over furrows, now it told dusk over battlefields. And people, dazed by the glitter, cheered the new age, even as the anvil taught their hands to spill blood with a cleaner line. Another spark opened in the mouth. Shemihazah taught words, hidden words that tug at the seams of the world like fingers on a knot. He showed the quiet breath to draw before speech, the steadying of the tongue, the small tilt of the head that makes a command lean forward. Charms were painted on door lintels in ash and wine. Cords were braided with colored fibers and bound at the wrist. Small figures of clay were warmed by coals and named with names that once only stones remembered. People began to trust the diagram more than the rain, the pattern more than the seed. A midwife whispered a line over the bowl and felt braver. A shepherd scratched a sign on the first lamb born under a certain moon and slept easier. The village healer learned the leaf that calms the burn and the root that wakes the numb, and there, just there, the gifts shone almost wholly bright. But shadows learned to travel with them. The same knot that steadied a mother's heart could clutch a rival's throat. The same leaf that cooled fever could blur a judgment. The same root that roused a failing man could pull him past the edge of wisdom. A ruler heard a chant that bent attention and used it in the court. A priest saw a sign that meant victory and forgot to ask what it might cost. A jealous neighbor found a charm that soured milk and could not put the taste back. Knowledge opened doors, yes, and many were doors without latches on the inside. A third spark mapped the sky. Kokabiel led shepherds beyond counting and sailors without coasts to watch the heavens with patience instead of fear. He traced the gates where the sun seems to rise and sink, showed how the moon keeps faithful count along the dark, how candles on velvet, those slow cold fires, lean in their seasons. Farmers learned when to break the ground. Builders learned to set a wall true by a star's unwavering point. Travelers carried the night inside their skulls, finding direction with eyes half closed. Calendars were sewn into cloth. Tall poles marked the turnings of the year. Songs taught children how to hear the long rhythm beneath the quick drum of days. For a while, the sky belonged to hope, and then the shadow drew its lines across it. Omens crowded like birds on a wire. A comet tore the fabric of confidence, and clans sharpened spears. A king saw an eclipse and sent messengers to demand tribute before the light returned. Priests stood on rooftops with polished bowls and read meanings that matched their hungers. Lovers counted unlucky days and never spoke what might have mended them. The same wheel that promised order could be spun like a game. The same star that pointed home could be made to point at an enemy. Under the predictable breath of night, fear found a new grammar. The fourth spark blossomed on the skin. Azazel's pupils, women and men both, learned to grind mineral into powder, to mix soot with oil, to tint cheeks with crushed berries, and ring eyes with coal, to braid hair with wire that caught sunrise, to pierce lobes and nostrils and wrists, and hang them with the bright answers of metal. Perfume rose from warmed stone, resin and myrrh, and sweetgrass pooling where bodies moved. Garments lay with seams straighter than reed stems. Dyes ran like small rivers through the courtyards, saffron, madder, indigo, until cloth held sunsets long after dark. Markets glowed, weddings were small parades, mirrors newly polished, were altars where people tried on faces like prayers. For a breath, beauty was gratitude. Then vanity learned to count. A wife who once clothed herself to honor a feast kept the festival burning in the mirror all year. A son who once wore a single ring as memory weighed both hands with proof. Eyes learned to measure. Throats learned to tighten. The poor, still poor, looked at their reflections and saw the outline where wealth should go, and some blew on that outline until it burned. The body, once a house for breath, became a stage where envy purchased seats. Craft, which should have been a hymn, slipped into idolatry, and even the simplest jug began to suspect it was more important than its water. Cities changed shape under such sparks. Streets straightened to serve the new traffic of amber and tin. Courtyards widened to hold furnaces. The law learned to make space for contracts with strangers, who arrived speaking the sky like a language. Loom halls beat like low thunder. Smithies flashed like storms behind leather curtains. Scribes, Penemue's quiet students, drew lines that kept memory for more than a lifetime, and the world discovered that ink can outlive breath. Grain tallies were stored in jars, then on tablets. Promises moved from mouths into marks. Kings found that walls of words sometimes hold tighter than stone. And still the shadow walked beside the marvel. Armies lengthened their stride upon roads made true. These very roads taught them how to leave home and never look back. Tablets that recorded harvests also recorded names of those fit for conscription. The market drew strangers whose hands were open for trade and closed for theft. A temple built to honor heaven learned to ask for fees. A court built to preserve peace learned to price it. The city woke each morning richer than it had been, and poorer in kinds of wealth that no jar could hold. People learned to specialize, and some learned to forget how to do anything that was not their specialty. When famine came, as famine always comes, hands used to one tool did not know where to place themselves. And the heart learned to bow to new idols. Some were literal, images that shone like dawn because the forge had taught gold to mimic the sun. Some were thinner, made from air, fame that could be weighed by how often a name crossed other tongues, novelty that tasted like sweetness and then left the mouth dry, certainty that felt like a warm cloak and then pressed on the throat. The watcher's gifts, metals, words, stars, mirrors, rose like pillars, and men tied garlands around them and called the pillars gods. Even virtue learned to wear a costume. Modesty became a contest. Wisdom hardened into a mask. Piety grew loud to drown its own fear. And somewhere, under this beautiful chaos, the old songs of gratitude strained to be heard. Grandmothers hummed them at thresholds while grinding flour. Shepherds whistled their fragments to dogs who never cared for omens. Children, drawing circles in dust, found that joy still fits inside small things. Yet the tide ran the other way. Blades argued more persuasively than lullabies. Ledgers spoke louder than pasture wind. Mirrors negotiated more firmly than elders at the gate. The fire that warmed kitchens found its reflection as fire that marched with spears. The ink that kept promises learned to trap them. The constellation that told a farmer when to sow told a prince when to conquer. By evening, even the teachers stood within their own shadows. Azazel, who had given the world a brighter edge, saw his pupils study only the edge and forget the hand. Shemihazah, who had offered words with weight, heard his syllables used to steer crowds the way a stick turns a flock. Kokabiel, who loved the sky's patience, watched men demand from the heavens what they were unwilling to learn from the soil. Penemue, ink on his fingers, felt the ache of seeing memory become a snare, a promise from winter brought up in spring like a chain. And Azazel's mirror learned its oldest lesson, that the face it gives you back is true, and the story you tell about that truth can still be a lie. Across the plains, the glow of forges faded to embers. Across rooftops, the last astrologers put away their bowls. In markets, the stalls were shuttered, and perfumers corked their vials. Yet under the quiet, a new noise gathered. The rustle of armor laid out for morning, the tap of styluses setting quotas, the creak of wagons rolling under banners painted with suns and moons, and creatures invented by men who had forgotten the names of lambs. What they gave seemed like gifts of brilliance. Each spark did warm. Each taught a hand to do more than it had done. But every spark carried its shadow, and the world, brighter to the eye, grew dimmer in the places where eyes do not reach. The giants grew restless, and the ground itself began to tremble beneath their hunger. Fields woke to footprints that spanned furrows like dry lakes, and dawn birds lost their courage when those shadows slid across the stubble. Wheat heads vanished before the sickle could show its shine. Orchards were picked to the last pale crescent, and threshing floors rang with the hollow music of wood striking wood. Mills turned air. Grindstones kissed and sparked. The mule walked its circle with a blank, obedient gaze. In hill villages, people learned to harvest in the dark, shoulders bent, mouths wrapped in cloth, carrying sheaves along paths that stepped from stone to stone. Children gathered spilled kernels from cart ruts and hid them in hems. Grandmothers put their hands on the warm stones of ovens and whispered a word that had once summoned loaves. Wind ran through the empty rows and came back thin, like a tired messenger. In a single afternoon, a summer's patience could disappear. The giants would pass with a sound like leather drawn across stone, pausing to inhale, pausing to lift their faces toward the high air, pausing to listen for the next place where life was gathered. Their arms swung, their shadows stitched fields into one long, failing seam. The breath that followed them smelled of crushed straw, wet bark, and the faint iron taste of the earth's open skin. The beasts went next. Stables stood with ropes unknotted and stall posts leaning, the patient rhythm of animals exchanged for a quiet that put the tongue against the teeth. Goatherds followed tracks over shale and did not return. Shepherds found wool in ragged streamers on thorn, and a milk-white scum where the brook ran red below the ford. At night the slopes carried a new sound, slow tearing followed by a deep, contented breath. And the dogs that had bayed at wolves folded themselves to the ground and shivered, ashamed of their collars. Cattle broke from herds and ran as if remembering a map no one had taught them. Horses blew foam and turned in tight circles until the rings they made were stamped into the hillside like moons. At dawn, bones lay among trampled wildflowers, clean in places where no crow could have worked so fast. Smoke rose from cook pits in the ruins of sheepfolds, and the hides stretched there, belonged to animals whose eyes had not yet learned to cloud. Men tested the fences and found the wood too soft to matter. Women sent their sons with bells and ash on their brows to drive the last calves into ravines too narrow for giants to enter. The bells made bright little sounds that melted when the first long step fell across the ridge and shook the nests from ledges. Fish fled the shallows and hid beneath stones. Cranes lifted from reed banks and chose higher water. The wetlands went silent in a single evening, as if a hand had been pressed over their mouth. It seemed sensible in those days to count wealth by how little noise it made. Then the boundary moved, out of furrow and fold, over the threshold of flesh that thinks and names. Villagers learned to count nights by who did not wake. Doors were braced with plough beams. Hinges were packed with clay to keep them from crying out. Shutters were tied with belts that once held up festival clothes. Mothers dragged the table over the hearth and sat behind it, measuring the breaths of sleeping children and the breaths between their own. When footsteps came, they did not hurry. They set their weight down with the unbothered cadence of owners passing through their own halls. Torches were held like toys. Walls were tested with a fingertip. The beam across a doorway rose as if it had learned to lift itself. Men who tried to stand in the gap found themselves pressed into the plaster like reeds caught in ice. Some towns paid tribute in cattle and grain and were given a season of peace. Others were told to bring a certain number of children to the old road at the first quarter moon, and when they did, the tribute was taken without a word. Priests burned flavored smoke toward the sky and wrote the names of the missing on roof tiles. Kings wrote decrees that declared fear illegal and had their scribes read them in markets where the voices would not carry. On the far edge of every settlement, there were always a few houses that chose courage in the open, families who lit lamps and kept the gate unbarred, just to remember what it felt like. They did not last long, though their neighbors spoke their names for years, and sometimes a child passing an old lintel would touch it with 2 fingers, carefully, as if the wood still remembered a pulse. The earth cried with them. You could hear it in wells when the bucket swung and the rope went briefly slack, a hollowness where water used to live. Springs lost their sweetness. Cisterns grew films like tired eyes. Cattle that drank there staggered and lay facing east as if waiting to be named and numbered. Cracks opened in roadbeds and ran like handwriting for miles. Fields tilted and stayed tilted, as though the soil had forgotten how to hold a horizon straight. Salt licked up from dry bottoms and wrote pale letters in the furrows. Even the sea felt altered. Tide lines crept higher up beaches without storms to push them. Fish washed in with scales dulled to pewter. Gulls circled and would not land. In forests, sap bled and hardened into amber tears. On prairies, the grass went to seed early and did not trust the wind with its children. Beekeepers lifted lids and found combs polished and empty. Millers held flour in their hands and let it sift away to prove that at least gravity was faithful. The old men who remembered good seasons said the ground had learned a new language, that the push of roots, the curl of shoots, the careful exchange between leaf and air had been rewritten in a hand that hurried. The women who sang at births sang at graves in the same voice. It was as if the planet had become a tired animal, panting and lowering its head, trying to make itself smaller under a weight no one could name aloud. The prayers rose through this air as through the ribs of a great instrument. There were few words. A name, a breath, the syllables of mercy arranged in patterns that poor throats could sustain. Some prayed standing in doorways with the latch in their hands, refusing to be found on their knees. Others lay face down on threshing floors that would never feel grain again. Old songs found their way back, melodies with small leaps and long returns that had been built to console famine and sickness in older years. A shepherd left a scrap of wool at the edge of a dry ravine and asked for rain without saying rain. A midwife carried a bowl of clean water to the roof and held it up, asking nothing, letting the sky see its own face. A child with a fever said a simple promise to share an apple, if only apples would agree to be born again. The sound of these voices climbed stone by stone, joined the smoke of meals carefully divided, wrapped itself around the last green of the last fig leaf on the last tree. Somewhere above the range of hearing, that sound gathered, slowed, and began to lean downward again, the way a hawk leans, searching. Those who listened with their bones felt a change, a stillness with edges, a hush that was not emptiness but attention. The world had been shouting in hunger. Now the sky seemed to hold its breath, as if listening for a name. Judgment had not arrived, yet the way opened toward it, straight as a path worn by desperate feet. In his sleep, Enoch was carried beyond the horizon of earth, into halls where stars burned like living eyes. It began as a weightlessness behind the ribs, as if the room had been lifted off its foundations and set upon the open air. The pallet under him thinned like paper. Breath slowed. The darkness gathered itself and became a road. Two figures stood where the lintel should have been, tall, cloaked in a brightness that moved like quiet water, hands extended with the calm assurance of those who have crossed this way many times. When they touched him, a coolness passed into his bones. The house slid away. The village folded into a single glimmer. The hills turned flat as a map. Then the map curled and vanished, and the sky received him with the ease of a home that had never forgotten his name. Wind did not carry him. Something gentler did. An intention as soft as a mother's palm. He felt the old fear rise, the fear that belongs to dust when it remembers the weight of glory, and the fear found no foothold. Beneath him, roots opened like veins of light through rock. Above him, figures moved in ranks, each distinct in posture and gaze, each tuned to a music he could almost hear. Their garments were colors he had no words for, yet his heart understood them the way a child understands the meaning of a lullaby long before language. The nearer of the two guides turned, a face bright and stern, and Enoch knew the name without being told. Uriel, Flame of God, the one who carries messages across horizons no cart can reach. Uriel's hand steadied him, and the world lengthened into brilliance. The first hall opened like dawn. Pillars stood that were more substance than stone, living radiance standing still. The floor held constellations under clear depth, as if he walked upon the night and left no footprint. Voices gathered from distant places and braided into a single tone that filled the ribs and taught them how to be a bell. Along the edges of the hall, watchers of the upper realm kept stations with the stillness of mountains and the attentiveness of hawks. Their wings were folded out of courtesy, and even so the air trembled where the feathers met. Enoch looked left and saw a gate of hammered gold that breathed. He looked right and saw an arch of crystal that held storms as ornaments. Every breath he took tasted like cedar and snow, like rain that has not yet fallen. Beyond the hall, a river burned. It ran clear and it ran with fire, and neither fought the other. Sparks lifted from it and learned to be birds. The birds rose and became letters. The letters arranged themselves and wrote meanings upon the vaulted dark. He watched a word fly out over the water and return as a decree wearing a crown. The river bent around an island where wheels revolved, wheels within wheels, alive, rimmed with eyes that opened and closed in patient rhythm. When the current touched those rims, it sang, low and layered, and Enoch could feel history settling into memory, as if stones were dropping into a deep well and finding their places without a sound. Along the bank stood the hosts. Some were like men whose faces held the quiet of long obedience. Some were thin and tall as lamplight, with brows that shone like first snow on basalt. Some were as compact as thunderheads, moving without weight, carrying within them the suggestion of gardens and cities yet to be raised. Each bore a mark, an instrument, a seal, a shard of inscription, and every mark corresponded to some labor in the world below. When one inclined his head, a mountain learned how to stand another season. When another extended a palm, a child in a distant hut woke without fever. The mercy among them was not soft. It carried edges strong enough to cut chains. Stars approached as beings. They did not merely shine, they regarded. Their light had temperature and temperament. One passed close, and Enoch saw within it chambers, stairways, corridors of singing stone. Another turned, and its face was a field with furrows of fire where sowers walked, scattering something bright as seed. He understood why shepherds have always spoken to the night. The heavens are not blank. Each point is a mind working out a song. When a company of them wheeled, their turning wrote geometry across the high air, laws that held oceans at their brim and told rains where to stop. He felt the map of seasons press against his skin and realized it was written from the inside outward. Uriel led him through smaller courts, where treasuries of the world were kept in simple order. A chamber of winds, each bound in a woven band of light. North sealed with frost-bright knots, east flickering with saffron threads, south heavy with the perfume of wet leaf, west smelling faintly of salt and iron. A chamber of waters, where springs began as clear thoughts, and rivers recognized their names before gravity called them. A chamber where seeds waited, sleeping specks of futures, while attendants moved among them, ensuring that each would meet its proper soil. Enoch reached toward a barley grain no bigger than a tear, and felt a whole village's laughter warm his fingers. He did not lift it. The guide's gaze said enough. Before the throne the floor widened until the horizon looked close. Fire walked there in shapes reminiscent of beasts and of instruments, and the heat carried the scent of myrrh and of rain on hammered copper. The throne itself rose as a mountain rises from plains, and yet it was nearer than any door. No face could be fixed upon it. A garment like snow in moonlight flowed from its seat to its first step, and the threads of that garment were days. Every day that had ever been, every day still hidden, woven into a single unbroken cloth. From beneath the seat poured the wide river he had seen before, and on that river floated books, bound in metals he could name, and in substances the earth has not tasted. 1,000 upon 1,000 stood ministering, row upon measured row, and the air did not crowd. A scribe stepped forward, tall, grave, gentle, and carried a tablet whose edges changed color with the angle of the light. He held a stylus that had never dulled. When he wrote, the marks burned and then cooled into letters that smelled faintly of cedar smoke. He did not ask Enoch's name. The tablet already held it. He wrote beside it a line that felt like a path being rolled out under Enoch's feet. A voice moved from the throne, and it was less a sound than a change in the weight of existence, the way a hand upon the shoulder changes the whole of a body without moving it. The voice named the corruption of the watchers, named the cry of the ground, named the ache of the righteous who had kept their lamps trimmed in empty night. Enoch fell when the voice fell. Hands steadied him. Fear went through him like winter through trees, clean, absolute, and passed, leaving rings inside the wood. He lifted his head and saw that tears had left pale tracks on the stone. and nowhere could he say whether they were his. Uriel stood at his left, another at his right, whose name filled the mouth like water, Raphael, healer of breaches. Between them, a scroll was opened that did not crease. On it a commission had already been written. He would carry words to those who had stepped across the boundary. He would speak to the sons of the high places, and to the men who had knelt to them. He would tell them what chains have been forged, what abyss waits true as gravity, what mercy still lingers for those who turn while time is time. The charge did not arrive as an argument. It formed in him as bread forms in heat, simple and nourishing without flourish. He understood that he was to remember more than sights. He was to remember weights, the weight of glory, the weight of law, the weight of a single child's cry when a door-bar lifts. He was to speak in fields and in courtyards and at thresholds where women hold bowls of water for the sky to see its face. He was to say that the Most High is not far. Judgment is prepared with the same steadiness that prepares morning. The patience of heaven is not neglect. Every secrecy has an appointed hour. Every gift has a reckoning. Each star knows its gate and keeps it, and the sons of men are invited to keep theirs. Uriel withdrew him from the blaze the way a midwife draws a child from bathwater, slowly with 2 hands, with a tenderness that makes the cold bearable. The halls narrowed into corridors where the music continued at a distance, like a festival heard from the next valley. The river diminished to a thread of brightness carried along the hem of the garment that trailed from the throne. The wheel's eyes dimmed to embers and watched without judgment. At the last gate, a breath met them, the breath of night on earth, dust and straw, and the faint dryness of old clay. Enoch felt the weight return, bones remembering their covenant with gravity, skin recalling the small language of wind through reeds. He woke with the taste of cedar and copper on his tongue, and the certainty that words had been placed in the hollow behind his heart. Outside, roosters rehearsed the morning. The stars above the roof leaned back into their usual positions, yet seemed more awake to him, as if a friend had passed through the market in disguise and had left a sign for those who knew where to look. He rose and washed his face with water that felt briefly like light. Then he set his feet upon the ground that still belonged to its maker, and began to shape the message, carefully, with pauses between the sentences, the way a man sets stones across a stream for children to cross without wetting their shoes. The prayers of the earth were answered, not with mercy, but with judgment. It began as a change in the weather of the unseen. Winds that had wandered without task gathered and faced one way. The stars, which had endured the boasting of giants without comment, tilted their gaze. In the fields, women lifting empty baskets felt the hair rise on their arms. In palaces, kings paused with goblets halfway to the mouth and tasted metal. The silence that had held for so long cracked like ice over deep water. From that fracture came a brightness that did not argue. It announced itself. The name that belongs to justice, heavy, clean, unbending, stepped into the world, and the world, which had bent under lawless appetite, remembered for an instant how to stand. They were seen before they were named, 4 presences moving with one intention, each carrying a portion of the decree. Michael travelled like the edge of a blade carried upright through a crowd. Where he passed, fear straightened into courage. Raphael moved as cool water after a fire, calm and inevitable, with the memory of gardens in his wake. Gabriel shone with a herald's surety when he raised his hand, air itself aligned to listen. Uriel came last, fire contained within a lantern, his step the measure of revelation. They did not descend to debate the watchers. They came to end the trespass that had torn the boundary between flesh and flame. Above the mountains where the oath had once been carved, the four drew into a cross of light that marked the place of sentence. The sky learned the posture of a court. The decree opened like a scroll in the wind, lines standing firm though no hand held them. Words spoke without mouths, and were understood by rock and reed and breath. First the petition of the watchers was answered. The pleading Enoch had carried upward, asking that their vow be set aside, that their offspring be spared, that sweetness might replace the gall they had poured into the world. The answer, no peace. The pages that had waited for mercy closed again of their own accord. Then came the judgments, each precise, each fitted to the wound it meant to close. To Raphael was given Azazel, to Gabriel, the giants, to Michael, the leaders of the watchers, beginning with Shemihazah, to Uriel, the words that must warn the righteous and steady them until the waters rose. Chains were named, fire was named, pits were named, time was named, counted, and bound to each sentence as surely as iron to a ring. Raphael went first into the wilderness. He found Azazel where the ground opened into a breathless valley, stone without green, wind without cloud, a place cut out of the map for punishments that had no room in gentler lands. The teacher of blades looked upon the healer and tried to smile with the old charm, the marketplace smile that had once sold mirrors and taught hands to love their own reflections. Raphael did not answer. He knelt and touched the sand, and the sand hardened into a floor of pale glass. He spoke a name, and rough stones rose, jagged as broken promises. Hands were bound, feet were bound. The face that had studied itself in 1,000 polished shields was smeared with dust. The chain that held him was not merely metal. It was the memory of every child taken as tribute, every field stripped of grain, every altar that had learned to charge for forgiveness. Raphael led him to a hollow named for desolation and sealed it with native rock. Above the seal the wind wrote small inscriptions that said nothing a man could speak aloud, and yet every moth that crossed there altered its flight. Azazel tasted the dark he had prepared for others and found it without spice. Michael turned his face toward the oath-swearers. Shemihazah stood at their center, the prince who had said, "Let us bind ourselves together," and made cowardice impossible. His eyes sought negotiation. He had learned to survive by the quick balance of words. Michael carried a balance that never shifted. He spoke the length of their punishment, the counting of the generations until a last day when fire would be permitted its full hunger, and the ground accepted the number without protest. Pits opened, not as trapdoors but as slow mouths in the earth that had been waiting for this meal. The watchers who had chosen flesh were given to depths where flesh cannot breathe. Their brightness, once sweet, had soured. Their knowing, once clear, had muddied. Michael's hand, raised and steady, did what it had been taught from the beginning. He put things back in their places. The defiant went under the hills. Their voices, which had once stirred women to song and men to weapons, thinned into murmurs that ended where rock begins to remember fire. 70 turnings were counted for them, and then the last reckoning would begin. Their petition, remembered, weighed, remained a closed book on a table no one else could touch. Gabriel gathered a breath and crossed the lands where giants ate the world. He did not draw a sword. He loosed a sentence sharper than iron, that the nephilim should turn upon one another, that their appetite should eat its own hand. In feasting halls carved from mountains, laughter slowed and broke into syllables that did not fit. Eyes that had never feared the spear looked at the nearest brother and saw a rival. The ground learned a tremor unique to that hour. The shock of great bodies meeting, the crack of pillars when shoulders carried by day for pride were driven at night for murder. In valleys, women dragged children into tree roots, while hills above them ran with sounds that no mother should learn to name. The giants, who had made men prey, became hunters of their own blood. Where two met, the earth split. Where 10 met, towns blew away like chaff. Their contests that had once been games turned without warning into sieges. The wine ran out first, then the meat, then patience. The smell of cooked marrow travelled with dawn. Gabriel, terrible and exact, oversaw the unravelling until the remainder was a ruin that did not need counting. The world, which had learned to fear the drum of giant feet, began to hear another cadence, the slow roll of a cleansing that says, enough. Uriel moved with messages arranged like tools in his hands. He found Enoch where the dust of fields clung to ankles, and the sky still looked close enough to touch. The messenger's presence calmed fear, without softening the truth. He placed the commission in Enoch like a lamp under the breastbone. Speak to the watchers who violated their station. Tell them their eyes will be fed darkness, as they fed light to their appetites. Speak to the men who sold their ore to idols. Tell them the hour of washing comes. Carry warning to those who keep faith. The man who builds a vessel when no sea is near. The women who salt grain and save it in clay. Uriel's words did not persuade, they established. He showed Enoch the outline of waters gathering in the mind of God, and did not yet speak their name. He set a line between dread and despair, and told the prophet to stand upon it and be steady. Across the world, signs answered the four as if the elements themselves had been waiting for instruction. Forges that had burned through the night sputtered and went quiet, their owners staring at cooled iron as if a friend had stopped returning letters. Mirrors clouded, and women washing their faces felt their fingers turn from ornament to bread. The astrologers climbed to rooftops with polished bowls and found the sky unwilling to be read by hunger. Idols stood on platforms and learned their weight without the cushion of adoration. Markets opened with smaller voices. The chains of judgment did not only hold wrists, they wrapped themselves around systems, the agreements and gestures and habits that had made injustice convenient. Roads that had once carried armies began to carry families in the other direction, and on those roads, heralds of fear met heralds of relief, and did not know which to believe. In the fields, the last standing grain bent under a wind that smelled like rain mixed with ash. Enoch stood before the places where the watchers had fallen and spoke the verdict that would not bend. His words travelled along old paths, the same routes that had once carried their invitations to feasts and lessons, now returning with sentences that closed doors rather than opened them. He told them what had been seen: the wheels with eyes, the river that burns and cleans at once, the floor before the throne where days are woven. He told them of Azazel's binding, of Shemihazah's counting, of the giant's self-consuming war. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He set each word like a seal upon a letter, and left it to harden. Among the pits a sound rose, regret without repentance, sadness afraid of its own cure. The earth carried that sound a little way, and then let it fall. The petition had been delivered. The answer had come. The hour for bargaining had passed. Michael returned to the heights where the oath had begun. Snow fell there, though the season below was still harvest. He lifted a hand, and the old carving in the stone, the memory of their vow, grew pale and brittle, then flaked away into powder the wind would not keep. He set over the place a new sign that could be read by mountains and storms: the boundary restored. Raphael walked through towns where the sick had learned to be currency, and unravelled the arithmetic. He broke prices that had been set upon bodies, and left in their place a pool of clean water, and those who bent to drink found that their mouths remembered how to bless before they knew a word to say. Gabriel touched barracks, and the sleep of captains changed. In the morning they did not shout as loudly, as if their throats had been lined in linen. Uriel's lantern turned in the eastern sky, while the western hills learned to listen for footsteps that would bring wood, pitch, and instructions against a rain no cloud had yet promised. There were fires that day, but not the kind the watchers had loved. These burned in places where the world keeps its quiet books. Altars kept by the righteous flared, and did not consume the hand that fed them. Hearths in poor houses glowed with a steadiness unfamiliar to hunger. Even the fires of judgment carried a cool undercurrent, a cleansing in the act of consuming, like nettles that sting and then heal the skin they've struck. Chains clinked in caverns where names were being forgotten by men and remembered by the one who counts without losing track. The mountains, which had learned to hold secrets, shifted a little to make room for the sealed rooms beneath them. Rivers, which had carried fear downstream, learned the taste of new prayers and thickened as if to shoulder them farther toward the sea. The nephilim were fewer before nightfall. Those who still strode the earth found the ground less willing under their heels. The echo of their steps shortened, and the echo of other steps. Pilgrims carrying children, carpenters measuring beams, beasts drawing carts piled with timber, multiplied. In places where giants had eaten the moon in the face of the river, lamps were lit and set in windows, and people looked at the small flames as if they had been returned something they had once owned and forgotten how to use. The forges warmed their bellies again, but the rhythm changed. The hammer kept time for hinges and plough teeth and nails meant for boats. In markets, spice sellers measured with a hand that no longer trembled. The sky retained its severe hush, as though the sentence continued to be read one clause at a time. When the four gathered again, the light around them made a circle that could not be broken by rumor. They looked across the plains and saw that judgment had entered like a storm with a strong mind, targeted, thorough, uninterested in spectacle. The world smelled of wet stone and smouldering wood. In that smell there was grief for what had been burned, and a quiet gratitude for the warmth left behind. Michael's sword remained unsheathed, not because he desired more cutting, but because the cutting had not yet reached all the places it must. Raphael's hands were damp with the work of setting bones in the body of a people. Gabriel's voice had done its work and sat within him like a clean weight. Uriel nodded once toward a horizon that had grown darker and then brighter beyond the dark, waters being drawn from their itineraries to meet in a single appointment. Enoch, who had stood in fire and breathed, carried the last lines to those who still waited for a softer answer. He spoke in the thresholds where fear had learned to stand guard, in courtyards where women held bowls of water for the sky's face, in fields where the wind had watched giants pass. He said the thing no one likes to hear, and everyone knows when it has been said rightly. The world will be cleaner when this is over. He did not promise that hands would be spared the labor of cleansing. He promised only that the cleansing would be thorough. In the distance, in places where the ground had cracked from thirst, a sound began, a gathering like hooves, like drums, like rain rehearsing. Judgment had rounded the first bend. The chains held, the pits were sealed, the fires were minded. What remained would come in its season, and the season was near. When the storms of judgment quieted, Enoch was shown the silent wheels of heaven. The air above the world felt newly washed, and in that clarity the guides returned, those patient companions of his first ascent. They did not seize him. They invited him forward with the courtesy of keepers at a sanctuary door. Uriel walked at his side with a brightness softened for human sight. and together they climbed a stair that did not cut the sky so much as become part of it. The stair opened into terraces paved with calm light. There the firmament was a living diagram, each measure breathing, each line a kindness. Enoch felt his heart slow to match the rhythm of that place. No shouting of armies, no hunger of giants, only intervals, ratios, turnings. "Look," said the guide without speaking, and the horizon unfolded like a scroll of patient geometry. Gates stood in the east, 6 portals set in a long arc, and opposite them 6 in the west, each attended by an angel whose posture was a number, whose number was a law. Through these the sun passed, season by season, and the year took its shape the way a river takes a valley, by returning, by remembering. They watched the sun keep faith. In the short days it rose from the farthest southern gate, climbed low, and drew brief gold across winter fields. Each morning it shifted one gate closer to the center, lengthening its arc, letting shadows loosen and children linger at play. At the middle pair of gates, those that face one another like well-matched pillars, the day and the night met in careful equality, and elders nodded as if greeting an old friend. Equinox. By spring the sun entered a gate higher still, poured warmth into stone, and showed vines where to reach. In the long days it rose at the northernmost door, strode the full breadth of heaven, and wrote generosity across threshing floors and rivers. Then, obedient to time, it began the slow return, each step accounted mercy. Enoch understood the year as a square of weeks, 360 and 4 steps laid edge to edge, a cloth of days woven to hold the work of beasts and men without tearing. Angels at the gates kept the measures, entering tallies in books that smelled faintly of rain and smoke. No page smudged, no line was cross, no daylight lost without being found again at its appointed door. When clouds thickened, another host drew back their curtains. When horizons ran clear, the path shone on its own. Watching, Enoch knew, the sun is a servant crowned. A king who remembers, he is steward first. They turned to the moon, gentler fire, teacher of nearness, lamp for roads that will not wait for dawn. Uriel traced its course with a finger that left no mark and yet left understanding. Light entered it as a tide enters a sheltered bay. On the first nights, a narrow brightness cupped itself over the dark, like a promise. Then portions returned in patience, sevenths and sevenths remembered, until the bowl filled and the moon became a silver harvest. Farmers looked up and chose the night for watering. Mothers spared a lamp and let the courtyard share in the cool. The moon tipped, poured itself back, and learned humility again. In this breathing of light and light withdrawn, the month took shape, a cycle delicate enough to carry a lover's oath, and strong enough to steady a caravan. Angels kept the count, touching the rim of that vessel with wands of thought, so it neither ran ahead of the sun nor lagged beyond the reach of songs. On appointed nights, a quiet correction entered the ledger, days tucked like threads through a hem to keep the garment square with the year. Enoch tasted the peace of it. How calendars grow from listening, how rest finds its place, because work is numbered and blessed. Below, men argued omens from bowls and smoke. Here, meaning simply held its measure, and offered it to anyone willing to look long enough to see. Now the stars approached, as persons keeping appointments. Each carried a name and a duty, a path so particular that even a child could find it twice and know it had returned. Some walked the high lanes and never stooped. Some dipped toward the sea and taught sailors how to measure courage. Some gathered in houses we call constellations and told old stories without needing words. Enoch saw a sower cast radiance into furrows of night, saw a hunter pause, forever drawing breath before release. Saw a river laid across the dark to remind deserts that water has a memory. Winds had storehouses at the four corners, each sealed with its proper knot. One cold and clean for the waking of mountains, one bright and dry for ripening, one heavy with leaf scent for forests, one salted for the long negotiations of shorelines. Rain had libraries of weight and grain. Snow had scripts of silence that teach villages to listen. Even comets, those brief visitors that make children point, were pages turned at the right time in a book that does not lose its place. "This," said the brightness beside him, "is how creation refuses chaos, not by shouting, but by keeping time." Enoch bowed and felt the shape of a charge settling in his chest, simple as dawn, sure as the next gate opening. He would go down and tell them what he had learned. That order is not the enemy of wonder, that the heavens do not conquer the earth but tutor it, and that to live by such measures is to live held, as vessels are held by the rivers that carry them home. In sleep, the world turned into animals, and their battles told the story of nations. The bed cooled beneath Enoch like a banked hearth, and a plain of dust lifted to meet him, edged far off by a thin seam of water. Upon that plain grazed a flock, white backs rounded like small moons, ears flicking, many-eyed with vigilance. They clustered and scattered as wind moved through them. No shepherd walked among them. The hills which usually carry sound returned only echoes. Above, a sky of hammered silver watched without blinking, and near the middle distance, a single lamb raised its face and bleated a name Enoch could not hear. And the name folded itself into silence, as if the world were holding its breath to listen for a better one. Predators arrived by breath, and then by shape. Wolves slid from the edges first, lean, grey, tongues low, herding rather than chasing, pressing the flock into useful panic. Boars rose from reed beds with shoulders bristling, ploughing furrows through lambs, as if turning soil for a harvest that would never come. Bears shouldered out of dark gullies slick with river mud, swatting at the light, rolling as if threshing. Then lions, manes lifted like banners from ruined orchards, stepped into the open and took what they wished, all grace and none of it kind. Above, black birds with iron beaks drew circles that measured the field. Their wings carved quiet geometry into the air. Talons flashed, feathers fell. The sky's patient wheels judged distances better than any eye on the ground. The flock shrank its courage and learned to run inside its own shadow. Upon a height beyond reach stood the Lord of Sheep, ringed by attendants whose rods shone like day. From his presence 70 keepers descended, set over the flock in numbered seasons, instructed to guard, to gather, to warn, to drive wolves to the edges and bring the strayed home. They nodded as if they understood. On the plain their rods hardened into spears. Gaps opened where walls should have stood. They bartered lambs for quiet, fed terror to buy themselves an hour of ease, and recorded the bargain as if the page could forgive what the hand had done. Some learned the flavor of tribute. Some learned the taste of sleep bought with another's cry. The flock knew the difference, and the difference taught it to keep its babies closer to the ground. The sheep wandered into cities of brick, where doors were low and gates were tall. Markets shone with salt and saffron. Foxes in pale robes tallied fleece with quick thumbs. Bulls yoked to ledgers turned their slow eyes from stall to stall. In courtyards stood golden calves with tongues of hammered leaf. Incense curled around their mouths, and the lambs that bowed to them rose smelling like smoke rather than grass. Some learned the art of glitter and forgot the path of water. Others kept their faces turned toward the far hill, wearing their hunger like a clean garment. Night after night a few slipped out of the lit streets, noses to the wind, and found their way back to stony springs where no altar demanded coin. Years thinned like fleece in drought, and horns began to swell upon certain rams, small at first, then pointed, then strong enough to catch and hold. One ram hooked the edge of a lion's mane and wrenched. The mane fell like a sheaf, and the lion's mouth remembered how to shut. Another learned the sidestep that makes a boar misjudge distance. Breath left the brute with a reed whistle sound. Around these horned ones the flocks gathered, and their march raised a long dust straight as an old road. They overturned calves and righted altars where grain could be blessed without a fee. They sang at walls that had learned to charge interest, and found those walls more brittle than the song. Yet the rams bled for each pace taken. A horn split, another broke at the root. Victory learned to walk with a limp, and the flock learned to keep going anyway. Overhead, the sky learned to carry empires the way backs carry loads. Great birds with hooked wings swept in from a bright east and pecked wolves and lambs alike, leaving a strict pattern behind them like a net drawn over water. After them leapt a leopard with bronze whiskers, light on his feet, carving borders with a flick of the tail, naming cities after his victories, teaching the flock new alphabets that tasted of copper and speed. He ran until the dust behind him rose like columns, and in that dust the lambs learned to count differently. Then a horned beast, heavy as an iron door, pressed down from the north. He did not run, he leaned. He taught the ground obedience by weight. Wherever he stood, roads hardened, taxes learned the habit of returning, and judges measured with iron rather than bread. The flock learned to live under the shadow of rules that did not ask their names. In the dream, the flock kept its history by color. Some sheep were white as salt, easily seen even when dusk tried to fold them into itself. Some wore soot along the spine as if smoke had lain there to sleep, carrying the memory of kitchens not their own. Some were dark as turned earth, steady as old fields, carrying patience on their backs. They bleated in different keys, but understood the same danger. When they huddled close, their shadows braided into a single rope. Predators sliced at that rope, and it frayed, then tightened, frayed again, tightened again. The keepers changed, their names changed, the rules changed, yet the rope remained, the shared stubbornness to remain a flock at all. The 70 keepers weighed their years and learned new hungers. They hired hawks that dove at a whistle only they could hear. They trained hounds to sing a note that slowed lambs mid-stride. They counted the flock by halves and drove the darker half toward the edges where grass grew thin and night arrived early. When rams objected, light flashed from the rods, and the rams dreamed of quiet for one day too long. Tributes swelled like riverbanks in flood. A few lambs vanished into the books and were never mentioned again, except by mothers who spoke into their sleeves and refused the flavor of festival bread. At last a little horn appeared, almost a joke at first, sprouting between two broken stubs on the head of a battered ram. It did not look like victory. It looked like persistence. It pointed not upward to impress the sky, but toward the nearest throat that threatened the lamb beside it. With that small defiance, a refrain began. Rams gathered behind it and found their balance. They learned to meet eagles with stones thrown from irrigation lines, to treat bores as rivers to be crossed rather than storms to be feared, to move along terrace edges with a patience the plains could not punish. The keepers frowned and counted again. The flock learned to breathe through its nose, quietly, and wait for the whistle to pass. Enoch, in a dream within the dream, stood in a field kneaded by many hooves. A house rose there, white and exact, with doors facing the four winds. Before the threshold stood a table, and upon it lay a book opened to a living page. The letters did not sit still. They grazed across the parchment like small, bright animals, drinking the inked streams and growing luminous. 2 figures measured the corners with a glowing cord. The Lord of Sheep entered, and the keepers were summoned to the threshold. One by one they were shown what had been seen in their days. Lambs traded for silence, gates opened at night, tribute taken in measures learned from hunger rather than from law. The page remembered what men forgot. The ground remembered too. A pit at the village edge sang names at a pitch only grief can hear, and the song rose like smoke that does not sting the eyes, because the eyes have already wept themselves to salt. Judgment did not shout. It arranged. The 70 were set in rows, and asked to name a single lamb they had returned at their own cost. Few could answer. The book turned itself, and the field gave testimony. Blood that had dried opened again. Footprints came back as dew on stone. Contracts crawled into the light like pale worms startled by rain. The keepers were counted out of their stations and laid aside like tools that had forgotten their purpose. New attendants stepped forward, quiet, exact, and set markers at the edges where wolves had learned to stroll. Rods warmed back into light. The flock stood still, and felt an old posture return to its legs, as when a body wakes from fever and remembers how to bear its own weight. Then the book breathed a new page. A lamb stepped forward, eyes clear, knees scarred. It was small in the way beginnings are small. Light gathered, not as a crown, but as a path, and along that path other lambs found their feet. Predators glanced over and, for a heartbeat, forgot their appetites. The little horn bowed to the lamb with a movement that looked like unlearning. From the hills there came a sound of water though the sky was dry, and the flock heard the name of a shepherd spoken as if it had always lived inside their ribs. The house's doors swung wide without hinges. The table grew long without carpenters. Mercy entered like a guest who knows where the cups are kept. The sky bent low to watch the clearing at the house's front. Dogs complained about leashes they had once begged for. Foxes defended their ledgers. Ravens offered accounting in bones. Bulls argued the history of yokes. The lamb did not argue. It walked. Everywhere it set a hoof, grass woke green and stayed. A straight way appeared where the ground had been trampled into confusion. The Lord of Sheep looked on, and did not need to raise his hand. The 70 were dismissed to silence. The bowl of sorrow was poured out as rain on thirsty ground. The birds that had wheeled for profit wheeled now for the joy of flight, and found that flight alone was profit enough. In the far distance beyond the house, a mountain brightened along its ridges as if dawn had climbed it from within. A white bull lowed there, a sound older than debt and cleaner than law, and the echo moved across the plain without losing a drop. Lambs lifted their faces and forgot the smell of fear for the length of a breath, and then longer. Enoch felt the dream tilt toward waking. The book shut itself with a soft breath. The house waited without urgency. The plain held its silence like a promise. In that hush, one meaning remained, layered and sure. The flock will have a shepherd. The keepers will be weighed. The beasts will grow weary of their teeth, and a path will stand where trampling once began. And when he opened his eyes, the shape of that path still glowed behind them, thin as a thread in the dark, strong as the rope of a people who have learned, after long scattering, how to walk together again. Amid the visions rose a figure, radiant, terrible, and tender, called the Son of Man. The air around Enoch stilled, as if creation leaned closer to hear its own heart. Thrones were set, burning yet unconsumed, and a garment white as first snow poured like a river over steps that seemed carved from day. From beneath the seat of the Ancient of Days flowed living fire, quiet as a spring, bright as 1,000 dawns arranged into one. Hosts stood in ordered ranks, eyes like lamps kept for midnight, wings folded out of reverence. In that silence a presence approached with the certainty of sunrise. He did not arrive by force. He arrived as a right returning to its place. His face held mercy that could carry grief without breaking, and judgment that could carry truth without pride. Those who had learned to love darkness felt their tongues grow heavy. Those who had kept a small light through ruin found their hands warming. The elect one stood beside the Ancient of Days, close as breath before speech. No crown glittered on his brow, yet authority gathered around him the way harvest gathers around a field that has been faithful. Books opened of their own accord. On their pages history breathed, each line a choice, each choice a path, each path a weight. He regarded kings whose decrees had taught wheat to bend away from the poor. He regarded priests who had set prices upon forgiveness. He regarded merchants who had measured with scales trained to favor the hand that owned them. His gaze did not flare. It settled. When it rested, the lie beneath a name loosened like plaster in damp weather. The truth within a quiet life rose and stood upright. Where he lifted a hand, hidden things came into air without shame. Uriel's lantern burned low at the edge of that court, and Enoch understood without words that he was being tutored in a grammar of glory. The Son of Man spoke, and the sound enfolded many languages without discarding any. He called for debts to be weighed against the hands that had paid them in tears. He called for promises to be found where they had been buried beneath ceremony. He called for fields to remember who had taught them patience in years when rain forgot to arrive. When he named a king, the scribe wrote the name, and the name trembled, then steadied, then showed its true size. When he named a widow, the page brightened in a small circle that touched 5 other lines and mended them. It became plain that power is not measured by the speed with which a city obeys. Power is measured by whether a child sleeps without fear. Around the throne lines of fire curved into parables. A tree rose, dry to the eye, and within it sang a green river hidden in the grain. A lamp stood in an empty room and filled the corners without moving. A shepherd counted 99, and then kept counting until the number grew a face. A stone rejected from the wall learned the patience to wait at the threshold where feet come home sore and unashamed. Each figure carried its own light. Each story turned back upon the hearer like a mirror that does not flatter and does not accuse. Enoch watched meaning step into flesh in a way no argument could discourage. He knew these sayings were seeds, small enough for a pocket, strong enough to crack history open from the inside. The elect one addressed the kings who had loved their thrones more than the people who lifted them there. He asked them what a crown was worth when worn before eyes that read marrow. He asked them where they had placed the grain that belonged to winter. He asked them who had taught them to sit so high that mothers' voices never arrived. Some crowns dulled and slipped like rings losing their fit. Others brightened because their weight had been shared. To those who had fattened wolves and called them guardians, he spoke a single line, and the wolves remembered their teeth were given for fields, not for cribs. To those who had taught prayers to serve pride, he breathed once, and the prayers found their true object and walked home. Then he turned to the humble, and his glory bent low without losing a spark. He named the righteous, whose work leaves only the scent of bread and the warmth of a mended blanket. He named the craftsmen who had shaped hinges and never stamped their mark. He named the women who had kept water cool and the door unlatched for neighbors who arrived with small shames. He named the watchman who had learned to distinguish between danger and tired men walking late. As each was named, a chair appeared along the shining floor, and none of those chairs bore arms for resting elbows. They were made for rising, for standing when the word required a witness. Their faces shone with a light that did not come from them, and did not leave them when they lowered their eyes. Enoch saw why this vision would travel far and trouble many. A figure standing beside the Ancient of Days with authority to judge, to heal, to restore. Such a one would teach fishermen to speak like prophets, and tax collectors to return what scales had devoured. Such a one would walk into empires without lifting a sword, and make governors feel the cold of a future day at the back of the neck. Such a one would say sentences that taste like bread, and carry a blade inside the crumb. Some would hear and weep with relief. Others would fear that altars needing coin would learn to live on gratitude alone. To academies that prefer questions without answers, he would arrive as an answer that asks for a life in return. To palaces that prefer praise without truth, he would arrive as truth, wearing a beggar's face and a king's patience. The elect one's throne drew near to the great seat so quietly that distance seemed a misunderstanding. He did not seize place. Place made room. Enoch felt the enormity of it. A man-shaped glory invited to sit where angels stand. The court did not dim under this approach. It found its tune. When he sat, the river of fire widened into a path that could carry villages. Books that had listed transgressions learned to list repairs, and kept both lists with a steadiness that would satisfy grief. The measure by which nations are weighed moved from conquest to kindness, from fear to fidelity, from noise to nourishment. The hosts responded without surprise, as if the song had always contained this verse, and the verse had finally been sung aloud. Enoch asked with his eyes how long this brightness had been prepared. The answer came as a memory he had never owned. Before the sun took its first gate, before the moon learned humility, before rivers agreed to run downhill, the elect one had been chosen. Chosen not as an ornament for heaven, but as a hinge upon which days could turn back toward their Maker. He would appear in poverty and carry a weight too many hands had refused. He would gather the broken and compose them into a people. He would split time and teach it to count hope. The court heard the promise like a chord struck low and pure. Some among the elders bowed not out of custom, but out of recognition, as if a face long loved in silence had just stepped through the door. The parables gathered into a single image. A vineyard planted on a hillside sent its fragrance down into streets where men had learned to speak loudly about small things. Tenants had grown used to keeping the songs that rose from harvest and forgetting the one who had tuned the slope and set the wall and dug the press. Messengers came and went with bruises for wages, and the tenants learned to laugh with their mouths closed. Then the air walked the rows, touching the leaves without plucking, blessing the stones that hold sun for night. The rose leaned toward him. The hill recognized his feet. The press learned a way to hold joy without waste. In that vision, blood and wine kept company without shame. And Enoch could not tell whether he was watching a memory from the world to come, or a promise pressed into the present like a seal. At the edge of glory, threats show themselves like stains in clean water. Thrones that prefer unexamined power feel exposed under a gaze that refuses flattery. Schools that traffic in cleverness feel poor before a wisdom that heals. Temples that sell nearness to God feel redundant when God lays a hand on fishermen and calls them friends. Scribal councils will argue about lists and dates while poor men stand healed, and the arguments will make the healed seem dangerous. Enoch saw why this book would be carried in secret by some and hidden by others, why those who love order without mercy would tremble, and those who love mercy without truth would fidget. The elect one holds both without dropping either, and this balance breaks the habits of every court that depends upon partial light. The vision drew inward. Enoch felt himself brought close enough to hear the quiet between the words. The Son of Man turned, and his regard fell upon him, gentle and exact. A sentence formed in Enoch as if written on the inside of bone. Carry this witness. Speak it in places where kings rehearse their titles, and in kitchens where bread is divided by finger widths. Tell them that a human face has been seated where fear once sat alone. Tell them that judgment is prepared for corruption, and honor is kept for the meek. Tell them that the Ancient of Days remembers names the world forgets, and that the elect one delights to speak them. The court dimmed to a kind of dusk that loved candles. The river narrowed to a thread along the hem of the robe. Uriel's hand found his shoulder, and the road toward earth opened like a door that has always wanted to be a door. He woke to ordinary darkness and the sound of water in a jar. A lamp burned small. Outside, the night had moved its constellations a hand's width, and a rooster practiced a quiet note as if afraid to disturb a guest. Enoch lay still, and knew the peril in what he had seen. To speak of a Son of Man seated near the Ancient of Days, to speak of a judgment that lifts the poor and questions palaces, to speak of parables that disarm empires, such sayings will loosen the nails in comfortable rooms. Yet the charge sat within him like bread sits kindly in the stomach after fasting. He rose, washed his face, and began to set words along a path that others might follow. Somewhere beyond the roofs, dawn waited for the first window to learn its color. He drew breath and prepared a sentence that could be carried by fishermen and kings alike, a sentence with fire at its heart and rest at its edges. And so the heavens opened, and the world drowned to wash away its shadows. The change came first as a stillness so complete that even birds forgot their lines. Forges cooled with a last sigh. Markets stood with coin half counted. The footprints of giants filled with a thin skin of water that did not ripple. Noah listened the way a man listens for rain in a season that has forgotten its name, and in that listening the instruction returned, simple and whole. Measure the timbers, seal the seams, gather the pairs. He laid his hand on wood and felt the world's old patience pass through the grain. Each plank answered with a low note when struck, oak, cypress, fir, tones that would become a single body meant to ride a sorrow no cart could cross. Around him, neighbors watched with the tired humor of people who have seen much and expect more of the same. Laughter carried while he set pegs and angled beams and brushed pitch along joins until the hull learned to be one piece. At night he lay down among coils of rope and dreamed of hills without footsteps. The gathering began with tracks penciled in dew before dawn. Hooves set the grass back on its knees. Pads pressed soft circles into dust. Wings wrote minor chords across the sky, then folded along rafters. None of the watchers in the hedges had whistles for this procession. Fox and hen shared a shadow, not from affection, but from obedience to a summons older than appetite. The heavy breath of cattle warmed the half-built ribs of the vessel. The neat clatter of hooves learned the rhythm of the gangplank. A serpent lifted its head at the threshold and went forward as if through tall grass. A raven measured a beam with its eye and declared it acceptable. The ark swallowed quiet, and the quiet settled into its belly like a seed bank waiting for rain. Noah counted, checked, tied, and checked again. He placed fodder where mouths would find it in the dark, and stored water where hands could lift it without stumbling. The smell was of hay, pitch, dung, and the faint sweetness that always arrives when many lives agree not to harm one another for a while. Beyond the fields, the nephilim watched from ridges and from the unanswering bones of their cities. Towers that had tried to touch the moon reflected their faces in windows dulled by ash. Some giants mocked in the way of men who have never learned to bow. Some set wagers on whether wood could teach water manners. Some sent tributes as insurance against a future they would not name. A few felt an old ache crawl up from the soles of the feet, the body remembering that it too had been made under a law it did not write. When the first drop struck their shoulders, they glanced up as if a bird had passed. When the drops became lines, they shook themselves like dogs and laughed. When the lines thickened into sheets that made the slope run under them, laughter thinned. The ground no longer kept the courtesy of holding still. The fountains of the deep rose through seams that had waited since the first dawn. Springs forgot their beds and stood upright like trees made of glass. Rivers unlearned their banks and wandered into streets, taking doors off their hinges as if harvesting leaves. Wells coughed and became throats. Cisterns swelled until their lids lifted without hands. From above came rain with a mind, layer upon layer, a tenderness so absolute it became severity. The ark shuddered where it lay on its cradles and then loosened, learning to breathe like a whale. Noah's sons ran their palms along the hull and felt it answer. Wind moved without hurry, though its feet were swift. Hills crouched lower each hour, and stones wore a skin that made them look younger and more dangerous. Inside the vessel, the world narrowed to corridors and stalls, to bowls filled and emptied, to sleep taken in turns. The creak of timbers spoke in a language Noah had learned as a boy under his father's roof. The doves dreamed with their heads under their wings and woke to drink. The goats argued across partitions because arguing makes milk. The cats slept as if they had invented safety and were pleased to see it imitated. In the dim light, each breath clouded and dissolved, and the ship felt like a chest rising and falling. Above, rain played the same measure on the roof, until even panic learned to count and tired of itself. Noah's wife carried a lamp and touched shoulders with it, blessing without words. Children traced knots with fingertips, and made games from counting how many turns it took to disappear into the rope. Outside, the giants learned the mathematics of water. They planted their feet deeper and the ground left them. They climbed and the hills slid with them. They leaped from rock to roof, and the roof abandoned its beams. Some tried to wade toward the ark through a forest of floating doors and fences, and the water wrote circles around their legs until the circles tightened. Others roared at the sky and threw stones that vanished without splash because everywhere had become splash. Along certain cliffs, hands like fallen trunks clawed for purchase and left scratches that looked like writing on a tablet the sea would never read. Their voices went low, then lower, then gravel, then nothing, and in that unvoicing the world felt a limit restored. Flesh that had taken too much space learned how small a body is when the element it despises chooses to be faithful. The watchers had no hills to climb. Their judgments were sealed long before the first drop struck the ark's roof. In caverns where rock has no patience for bargaining, chains answered their movements with a music of iron. The names that had once charmed markets lay dull on the tongue. Raphael's binding held Azazel where sand becomes glass, and glass forgets light. Michael's numbering held Shemihazah and his princes, where counting adds nothing and takes nothing away. Their petitions rose, not as smoke, but as a draught from a door that would not open, and the draught cooled the wrists of those who had once set bracelets on them. Above the pits, Storm passed without notice. The flood was for the surface, for fields and courts and kitchens. The sentence in the deep kept its own weather. Time learned to sit down at the mouths of those hollows and wait without tapping its foot. Days folded into one another like wet linen. There was no horizon, only a leveling that made every direction honest. The ark learned small courtesies that keep a body from bruising, how to shoulder a wave, how to roll the weight of many lives across a swell without spilling. Noah released a raven, and it went to and fro above a world that offered perches without promises. He sent a dove, and it returned with surprise in its eyes, as if the sky had become too wide for comfort. He sent it again, and it brought back a leaf that still remembered a vein of sunlight. The little branch smelled like a garden speaking under its breath. He sent it a third time, and it kept the silence of those who have found what they were made to find. A wind rose that did not bully. The great waters tired of their own company and began to move aside. Peaks returned like knuckles breaking the surface of a bath. Slopes showed ribs. Mud learned to keep a footprint again. The ark sighed into its resting and knew it had done enough. Noah opened the door and let the world's scent reach into places where oil lamps and animals had taught a different kind of weather. The breath that entered carried crushed pine, raw clay, a ghost of salt. Hooves met earth and hesitated, then trusted. Wings unfolded and wrote new lines above ridges washed clean. The cats inspected the threshold as if they had been the builders and approved the seam. Noah stepped down with knees that noticed gravity after long negotiation. He raised a heap of stones with hands that had forgotten how to stack anything, not shaped like planks, and set fire to the top, with wood that popped softly, as if small lives were telling jokes. He scattered thanks as if sowing. Words rose and did not need to climb. No angel counted his sentences against him. The account had been settled elsewhere. The old world had ended with a sound like unthreading. What remained spoke in the grammar of beginnings. Clouds kept their distance. The sun stayed the course set for it when the gates were named. A bow arched color along the damp air, not as ornament but as treaty. Light bent into a sign that promises will not drown because someone remembers them. Noah placed his palm on the warm stone of the altar and felt the answer pass through it, steady as the pulse he had learned to check at night in children's throats. In the valleys, quiet studied itself. Fields lay without fences and did not miss them yet. Streams curled like infants and tested their voices. Trees held out their hands and counted leaves, then counted again. Every creature moved with the careful cheer of a guest cleaning up the room it has slept in. For a while there were no footprints larger than a man's. The earth breathed, and the breath did not catch. Yet not every shadow was erased. From the bodies of the giants rose something that did not need air. The hunger that had learned to be more than a stomach looked for new forms, thinner than flesh, quicker than footsteps. Men would later give them many names. Enoch understood them as remnants, spirits without homes, trouble that survived the water because water was not built to drown a thought. The chains in the deep remained faithful, and the day appointed for final counting did not lose its place in the long ledger of God. Noah planted, and the ground answered. Vines learned to climb again without tearing their own hands. Grain rolled in his palm like coins from a different economy. Children ran and did not glance over shoulders. Women washed pots in streams that no longer tasted of roofs. Men measured plots without reaching for spears to correct a line. The ox remembered the yoke without resenting it, and leaned into the furrow with a low sound that blessed labor. Even the wind seemed newly hired and eager to keep honest time over barley heads. Laughter returned with a different pitch, lower, richer, surprised by its own endurance. And then, as all new mornings do, the day dimmed toward evening. The ark settled in the high land and became a shed for tools, then a story, then a silence that watched men lay the first row of stones for towns that would need advice again. The flood did not teach soil to refuse thorns forever. It taught memory. It taught limits the way water teaches its banks each spring. The world would learn ambition again and would need other words, other days of reckoning. But for a span of seasons there was a rightness underfoot, a cleanliness like linen dried in clear wind. Enoch held that span in mind as one holds a bowl of water for a child to drink, steady, careful, knowing how easily the hand can shake. When he set down the vision, the quills dried quickly, as if the page preferred not to be smudged by more. He wrote that the watchers remain bound until the hour that has been counted for them. He wrote that the flood served the living as well as the dead, washing the memory of worship demanded by those who never deserved it. He wrote that the rainbow is a commandment as much as a comfort, an order set upon water and fire to remember their appointed work. He wrote that silence after judgment is not emptiness. It is a room prepared for breath to return without fear. Out on the plain, a breeze moved through grass that had never before felt rain from every direction at once. Somewhere a child laughed at a beetle rolling a ball of mud as if pushing the world. The heavens, which once opened, closed again with kindness and kept their gates, and the earth, rinsed and wrung out, lay quiet under a sky that had learned the cost of forgetting. But why was Enoch silenced? Why hidden when other books were preserved? The question lingers like incense in a room long after the priest has gone. A book that spoke of angels who fell, of forbidden knowledge, of a son of man who would judge kings. Such a book walked too close to boundaries. It was quoted freely in the first centuries, cherished in some communities, and whispered by those who saw in it both hope and danger. And then slowly, doors closed. Scrolls disappeared from libraries. The name remained, but the voice grew faint. Among the rabbis of old, Enoch's vision stirred unease. His tale of angels desiring mortal women, of giants who tore at the earth, was judged too strange, too extravagant, too close to myths from other nations. They prized Torah, the foundation of law, and saw in Enoch not foundation but wildfire, a book that explained too much, revealed too much, invited questions best left sealed. To them, prophecy was for a time, but wisdom was for the ages. Enoch's words, too apocalyptic, did not sit well at the council tables of order. Better, perhaps, to set it aside and let it vanish in the folds of silence. The church that rose from Rome's streets faced the same dilemma. In Enoch's parables was a radiant figure, the Son of Man, seated beside the Ancient of Days, a judge not only of men, but of kings and angels. For the first followers of Christ, these words glowed with recognition. Here was the shape of their Messiah, prefigured long before Bethlehem. They copied the lines, carried them into sermons, and heard them as confirmation that history itself had been speaking of the one they followed. Yet for bishops who sought a unified canon, who wished the faith to appear measured, reasonable, and distinct from wild prophecy, Enoch was a liability. Too close to revelation, too bold in its language, too ready to promise the end of empires, such a book was not fit for councils that preferred harmony over fire. And so the decree fell. Other texts survived, histories, letters, gospels chosen and copied. Enoch slipped into shadow. Only in Ethiopia, high among mountains where stone churches were carved into living rock, did the book remain. Translated into Ge'ez, guarded by monks who chanted its visions beneath painted domes, it lived on as scripture. There, Enoch was not an outcast, but a prophet. His words shaped liturgies, his warnings echoed in hymns, his visions entered the imagination of a church far from Rome's reach. For centuries, the outside world forgot it, believing the book lost, until travelers returned with astonishment, carrying not rumor, but the text itself. Then came the Dead Sea Scrolls. In caves above Qumran, parchments sealed by dust carried fragments of Enoch in the language of their birth. No longer a medieval curiosity, but an ancient voice, a text alive before the Gospels, before the Temple's fall. Proof that generations once read it with reverence, proof that suppression had not erased it completely. Scholars blinked at the fragments, rubbed their eyes, and began to ask uneasy questions. Why was this voice silenced when others were preserved? What truth had it spoken that made the powerful tremble? Perhaps it was too dangerous. It dared to describe angels chained and kings condemned. It dared to place judgment not in the hands of empires, but in the hands of the Most High, beside whom sat a figure in human form. Such imagery could unsettle priests who dealt in compromise, rulers who dealt in tribute, scribes who dealt in rules. Perhaps it was too revealing. It spoke of heavenly secrets, the courses of the stars, the storehouses of wind and snow, mysteries meant to remind mankind that the cosmos itself had order, and that those who transgress it will answer. Or perhaps it was too apocalyptic, too filled with endings. A book that tells the world it will be washed away, that tyrants will bow, that injustice will be erased. Such a book is not comfortable company for power. And so Enoch walked into silence. For centuries he was remembered only in fragments, whispered in footnotes, rumored in monasteries. Yet he was never fully gone. Hidden in Ethiopia, sealed in caves, guarded by dust and stone, he waited, until the time came when the world was ready once more to hear conspiratorial whispers in its sacred history. The book that should not exist continued to exist, unsettling, luminous, waiting like a sealed chest at the back of the room. But why was Enoch silenced? Why hidden when other books were preserved? The answer may never be whole. Perhaps it was fear, perhaps wisdom, perhaps the very hand of providence, ensuring that words too sharp for their age would survive for another. Tonight we can only lean close to its pages, listen for the breath still inside them and wonder what truths were thought too dangerous to share, and what dangers remain in truths yet to be spoken. Enoch walked with God, and was no more. Yet his voice lingers, like a whisper in the dark. The tale ends not with a tomb, nor with a monument, but with absence. A man who once tilled fields, raised sons, traced the courses of stars, and carried messages for heaven, was taken. No grave marks his resting place, no stone bears his name. Scripture simply says he was gone, gathered into the mystery of God's own presence. And yet his words, preserved, hidden, revealed, still move like currents beneath the surface of history. They remind us that some voices refuse to be silenced, even when pages are torn and councils forbid their echo. The Book of Enoch is both lost and found. Lost, because for centuries it vanished from the libraries of the world, whispered only in Ethiopia, half remembered in footnotes, rumored in fragments. Found, because its voice rose again from caves and manuscripts, surprising those who thought they knew the boundaries of Scripture. its survival feels like defiance, as though heaven itself intended that the testimony of angels and giants, of visions and judgment, of hope and terror, should not be erased. Each rediscovery is less a scholarly triumph than a reminder. What is buried can breathe again. What is silenced can still sing. What then is its legacy? Perhaps warning. The watchers who fell teach us that desire ungoverned by law leads only to ruin. The nephilim remind us that appetite can consume the very earth that feeds it. The cries of the righteous show that heaven hears, even when the world seems deaf. Judgment, in its sternness, is never far. Mercy, in its quietness, is never lost. The book warns that no secret oath, no hidden act, no rebellion clothed in beauty, escapes the gaze of the Most High. Its pages tremble with the knowledge that power, when abused, sows its own destruction. But it is also promise. The elect one, Son of Man, radiant beside the Ancient of Days, points toward hope that endures beyond empires. His presence declares that the meek are not forgotten, that the humble are remembered, that justice is woven into the pattern of creation. The rainbow above the flood, the order of stars through their gates, the parables whispered in visions, all assure us that chaos will not have the final word. Enoch's book stretches a hand across centuries, telling those who live in trembling times that there is meaning, there is order, and there is a throne that cannot be toppled. And so his legacy lingers between heaven and earth, neither fully canon nor fully erased, half condemned and half celebrated. The Book of Enoch stands at the edge of our understanding, like a threshold we are afraid to cross. It invites us into mystery, where the line between vision and dream blurs, where prophecy sounds like poetry, and where history becomes myth without losing its truth. To read it is to stand in twilight, holding a lamp that flickers with both dread and comfort. Enoch walked with God and was no more. Yet his voice still calls across the silence, warning, promising, whispering that what is hidden may yet be revealed. Perhaps that is why the book endures, not to satisfy curiosity, but to remind us that we too walk between earth and heaven, between what is seen and what is still concealed. The rest is quiet, the rest is waiting. And as the listener drifts towards sleep, the story lingers like breath upon the air, a voice fading, but never gone.